The actress in it is the lady from Resentment. That was Annie, her sister. Do you remember that actress?
Yeah, I didn't watch it yet. It's like all she's
The groom of the bride. Okay.
She bankrolls.
Okay, stay together for a minute.
And
All right, I think we're ready to get going, you guys. Thanks for coming out. It's Ethics Center's first event of the semester, so we're glad you're here. If anybody's here for extra credit, I know one or two people are, there's a sign-in sheet at the back. That's extra credit that your prof may be giving you, but we also are approved for the signature program, so grad students, this applies to you too, actually, if you're interested in crafting a pathway that might be recognized by the university. This is one of those events that's approved for signature credit. This does mean I need your email address in addition to you checking off in the signature box. We have a couple of book clubs going on. We have one that's finishing up on Tuesday on David Denby's book, Lit Up. Sorry, I'm tripping over myself here. So there's that book club that's finishing up on Tuesday, and then we have a new one starting up on Wednesday of next week on Moral Machines, led by Alex Kelly, philosophy student. So that should be a really fascinating conversation, and there is still time to sign up. There's information about the book clubs in the back, as well as the rest of our lecture series. And to that end, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody of the next event, which will be on February 8th, 7 p.m., 3508 Canals Hall, and that will be the talk by the author I just mentioned, David Denby, staff writer and former film critic for The New Yorker, who will be speaking on the topic of the humanities in the age of demagoguery, and it is part of the Center for the Humanities Promise of Education Speaker Series, which the Ethics Center is co-sponsoring. As for today, our program is entitled, Where Do You Stand in Times of Trouble? And it is part of the university's observation of the Martin Luther King Jr. celebration for 2018. I'm grateful to Dale Brown, who has organized this panel and will be moderating tonight. He's an MA student in philosophy, and I will turn it over to Dale.
Thank you. You just said all the things that I say to this point. Good. Okay, I'm going to repeat some things, but I think they're worth saying. So my name is not worth repeating. We don't need that. Thanks for coming to the panel. We appreciate it. So I am an MA student in the Department of Philosophy. Importantly, as it relates to this project, I'm a founding member of the WMU Prison Education Program. So my colleague Andy will be saying something about that in just a few minutes. I'd like to thank Dr. Borden from the Center for the Study of Ethics and Society for her support and patience with this project. Like big old emphasis on patience. I think I would have told me to go away like a long time ago. Bless you for that. Okay. Also, thank you to Lindsay Hunter from the Center for her support as well. And finally, a thank you to that's my nightmare. I gotta be honest. There we go. No worries. Thank you, Keegan. Keegan is also part of the presentation now. Please thank him. Department of Philosophy. Appreciate that. So as Dr. Borden mentioned, this is part of the 2018 MLK celebration, the theme of which is, what is your position in times of challenge and controversy? So it's inspired by the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Quote, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. So, with this panel, we intend to argue that in times of trouble, we should stand, if not next to, at least like somewhere in the vicinity of the philosopher Karl Marx. So this presentation actually has nothing to do with him, but like we steal some of his words, right, applied to this theme. He says something like, interpreting the world is necessary, but mere interpretation is insufficient to trouble times, and perhaps just times full stop. The point, he wrote, is to change the world, and that project of actually doing something in the world demands sustained activity on the part of the interpreters. So with that thought in mind, thought from Marx that we're stealing out of context, kind of, not really, and these words we have projected above, the aim of the panel then is to elevate activity over theory by calling attention to efforts within Southwest Michigan communities to alleviate systematic harms, and reform unjust systems. Okay, that's the theme in a nutshell. I'm tempted. No. Okay, so I really, this to me is not important, so I want to get to the panelists. Our first panelist is going to be Mr. Andy Marquis. Andy is also a graduate assistant in the Department of Philosophy here at Western. He hails from, did we decide, is it Illinois via Vermont, or is it the other way around? I don't want to look stupid when I say
Vermont via Illinois.
Cool. He is also a founding member of the WMU Prison Education Program, which was founded way back in the year of 2017. Okay, so he has an MA in astronomy, or what's the cool one? Astrophysics, either way. An MAT in curriculum and instruction. Good? Okay. All right. Next, we're going to have Mr. Demetrius Wolverton. He's the Mission Impact Manager at the YWCA. Is it YWCA Kalamazoo or YWCA of Kalamazoo?
No, it's YWCA Kalamazoo.
Okay, thank you so much. He is an alumni of Western, so welcome back. Thank you. He graduated in 2013 with a BBA in finance, along with a minor in communication and general business. So after that, this is last year, Demetrius received his master's degree in public administration from Central Michigan University. So Mr. Wolverton, I like this next sentence, by the way, I didn't write it, but I think it's cool. Mr. Wolverton, a former educator, is a high-performing, strategic thinking, collegiate professional with more than 5 years of experience with community-based projects, budgetary event planning, and racial equity facilitation and training. That sounds pretty cool. The primary reasons for his interest in his role at the YWCA Kalamazoo are, one, knowing that it plays a vital role in the community, two, that it is a pillar for resources, three, has initiatives in education, four, serves the community through advocacy and quality programming. So Demetrius sees his role as Mission Impact Manager as an opportunity to work in a community-centered learning environment where his creative approaches and strategic thinking can be used to enhance the YWCA, its initiatives, and opportunity to engage community members in explicit conversations about the impacts of structural racism. Finally, tonight we're going to have Dr. Linwood Cousins. He is a professor of social work here at WMU. He's also the director of the African American and African Studies program. Dr. Cousins joined the School of Social Work faculty July 1st, 2009. He served as assistant professor in the school from 1994 to 1999. After leaving the school, he served as associate professor of anthropology at Kalamazoo College, associate professor and interim chair in the social work department at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and professor and chair of the Department of Social Work and Communications Sciences and Disorders at Longwood University in Virginia. Dr. Cousins' teaching interests include practice with individuals, families, and communities, and human diversity and equality in context of K-12 education, and community and family life. His research centers on culture, education, and inequality in the context of community and family life. Thank you for sitting through that. Please, Andy. So here's actually something about the format, I think. Okay. So that was the intro. Now we'll have 10 minutes from each of the three presenters. When that is through, we're going to do something like 25 to 30 minutes of open Q&A from you all. You ready? Please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to change slides real quick. I have one visual. I'm just going to jump to it now. There it is. And thank you all for being here. I am here, like Dale said, as a representative of the WMU Prisoner Education Project. But the person most responsible for the project, its existence in the first place even, is this evening's moderator, Mr. Dale Brown. And I should be clear that the project as it stands now is still in its infancy. The figuring out phase, the searching for money phase, the realizing things we forgot to consider first time around phase But the basic idea is that Western graduate students and faculty will teach 4-credit courses to inmates at Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan, which is about an hour's drive southeast of here. Currently, the thought is that the project will unfold in sort of 2 stages. In the first stage, a contingent 1, 2, maybe 3 philosophy graduate students will pilot a critical thinking course, and I think it's an open possibility that some other philosophy classes might figure into that first stage at some point too. The idea is to start with critical thinking. For stage 2, the idea is to open it up and invite in other departments to expand the program's curriculum, sort of increasing the utility for the student inmates. Yeah, tonight though, what I'd like to use my time to discuss is the ethics of prisoner education generally. And in particular, I want to make sense of their goodness in terms of some work done by Iris Marion Young. This is just one line of reasoning available to prisoner education advocates. Lots of others, some may be better or more appropriate to the context. If anybody would like to speak out on those ideas we have, like during the Q&A, like we're really keen to hear those ideas. But Young's conception of the person and her attending conception of justice, for better or worse, they represent what's authentic to our understanding right now. So with that in mind, a good place to start is to note that the prisons are by and large awful places for human beings. And there are lots of human beings in them right now. And in fact, we're in the midst of this sort of incarceration spike that started in like the late 70s, early 80s. In 2015, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there were 1.5 million people housed in state and federal penitentiaries. On average, these individuals are something like 8 times likelier to be murdered and 20 times likelier to be physically assaulted than non-inmates. There's a quote from a paper by a guy named Robertson in 1996 called Fight or It's about self-defense, inmate self-defense in prisons. He says, prison personnel cannot or will not protect inmates from rape, assault, and other forms of victimization. In prison, your back is against the wall. So prison conditions are antithetical to prisoner well-being, in both physical safety-wise, but also like human dignity-wise. And one issue is that lots of individuals cycle into and out of, and back into and back out of prisons. Each year, 700,000 inmates get released back into society. Within 3 years, 40% of those released will recidivate. It's thought that one key driver of recidivism is education, or more specifically, like the lack thereof. One function of a normative education is to prepare individuals to better navigate society by helping them acquire useful skills, understandings, and experiences. So 37% of inmates lack a high school diploma or equivalent, whereas the figure for the general population is 19%. We're confident that the relation between education and incarceration comprises both like correlative factors, but also like causal ones. Of course, there are a lot of non-educational drivers to recidivism too, and those can matter a great deal. They're just kind of beyond the scope of our project. So the good news regarding inmate education, though, is that those who participate in education programming while incarcerated recidivate at a lower rate. According to a recent meta-analysis done in 2015, the odds a participant inmate will recidivate are 43% lower than a non-participant inmate, suggesting that education programs would reduce the 3-year rearrest and reincarceration rate by something like 13%. Crucially, the connection that's being reported here is a causal one. It's drawing from studies with a scientific design where they've done everything they can to control for confounding variables like the background characteristics of the prisoner that might sort of give rise to a correlation. So prisoner education programs cause fewer individuals to be forced back into what is a pretty vicious environment, and that's a good. But it's not merely that non-recidivating inmates are going to avoid grave harms, or by remaining in society, the life paths available to them will make possible a wider range of potential goods. Like the cultivation of flourishing social relations or increased socioeconomic well-being. And so it's worth saying a little more about that wider range of goods, and for us, that's where this intersects with the work of Iris. So Jung conceives of the person as at bottom a doer and an actor. This is in her own words. As doers and actors, people seek to promote learning and using satisfying and expansive skills in socially recognized settings. Participating in forming and running institutions and receiving recognition for such participation. Playing and communicating with others and expressing our experiences, feelings, and perspectives on social life in contexts where others can listen. So for Jung and for us too, that's kind of what people are about. To fully realize that conception, individuals must live free from two things. One is oppression and the other is domination. And that sounds like a great way to live, just sort of on the face of it, but we can flesh that idea out a little bit. So what it means to live free from oppression for Jung is that people must be free to cultivate their capacities. And they must be free to communicate their experience in these contexts where other people can listen and share too. To live free from domination, people have to be able to participate in determining their life path, as well as those social realities that characterize the background against which their life path unfolds. So freedom from domination is going to somewhat resemble the doing of a broadly construed politics, kind of like an Aristotelian idea of politics. Jung's fully realized person does not merely chart her own path through life and sort of against an immutable social landscape. Rather, she and her social fellows cooperate, negotiate, share decision-making authority, and collectively self-determine. To the extent possible, at least, the features of their shared social landscape. So under this conception, prison is going to be both oppressive and dominating of inmates. But the implementation of prisoner education programs is going to work against the oppression and the domination in two ways. So first, while incarcerated, the education programs are going to provide opportunities for inmates to develop their human capacities. And also the prison classroom itself is going to provide a context where other folks can listen and express to. Second, after release, the program participants are less likely to recidivate, which means they're likelier to remain in society, or at least ideally, they're going to be better able, than they were in the prison context, to develop and express additional capacities and chart life paths with fewer encumbrances and obstacles. That's the ideal, and it doesn't, necessarily work that way, but that's the thing that is being shot at at least. And so, the claim is that participation in education programs is going to bring about those goods for prisoners, but it also is going to bring about a good for society as well. And so if, as Jung says, social justice is going to concern the degree to which society contains and supports, nourishes the institutional conditions necessary for the realization of those goods, like a life lived free from oppression and domination. Then inmate education programs, the well-implemented ones anyway, are going to clearly help society itself just achieve a greater degree of justice. Social justice understood this way is going to entail an essential element of indivisibility. The idea that my good cannot be decoupled from my neighbor's good, that sort of thing, and vice versa. So Eugene Debs spoke to this when he said, "While there is a soul in prison, I am not free." And in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, MLK famously wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." But I think the line that follows that one in the letter, where he explains it, is just as important, and it's this: "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." So, thank you, and thank you for having me and for being here. Thank you.
Is my slide up?
Yeah, there you go.
So hello everyone. Of course you know my name is Bernhard, and I am the Mission Impact Manager for YWCA Kalamazoo. If you do not know what our mission is at YWCA Kalamazoo, it is to eliminate racism, empower women, stand up for social justice, and help families and strengthen communities. About 2014, our mission was just to eliminate racism and empower women, and then we had an advocacy campaign where we had to add some things to our mission because we were missing and creating some gaps. I do want to talk to you about some of our services, some of the things that we do at the YWCA to actively advocate against disparities. So we have our sexual assault program and services that provides counseling, crisis lines, support groups, research referrals, advocacy for victims of sexual assault, their families, and prevention and education for the community at large. In addition to that, we have a nurse exam, which is a comprehensive nurse exam for any survivor of sexual assault. They receive that to up to 120 hours after an incident has occurred, so that's 5 days. All of our services at the YWCA are free. We also have a shelter on site for victims of and survivors of domestic violence, where they can come stay in the shelter up to 5 weeks. During that 5 weeks, we are putting them in contact with advocates and therapists and other things that they may need so they can transition back into society. If you identify as a woman, so that means if you are biologically born a woman or if you identify as a trans woman, you can stay in our shelter for up to 5 weeks. If you are a male and you're experiencing DV, all of our services are open to you. However, you cannot stay in our shelter. We will, however, pay for you to stay in a hotel or one of our transitional housing units up to 5 weeks. One thing that the YWCA is specifically doing to address racism, specifically here in Kalamazoo, is Cradle Kalamazoo. Does anyone know what Cradle Kalamazoo is? Does anyone know what infant mortality is? So who can tell me what infant mortality is? Some of you shook your head. I'm calling you.
The death rates of children.
Yeah. So it's the death rates of infants. So that is what the government uses to measure how healthy a community is, right? Here in Kalamazoo, we have one of the highest infant mortality rates amongst Black babies. It's higher than Detroit, Flint, and Lansing combined. Here in Kalamazoo, Black babies are 4 times more likely to die before their first birthday than their white neighbor's child. One thing that oftentimes gets put in the conversation is income. So income may be a social determinant, but it's not a protective factor. So a woman of color who is middle class, who is educated, who lives in a suburban area is 4 times more likely to have a poor birth outcome here in Kalamazoo than a white woman who lives at the poverty line. And that is directly connected to lack of cultural competency in our medical field here in Kalamazoo and our services around prenatal care and things like that. Also, racism is a social determinant because it has an impact on mental health, which also impacts pregnancy and termination of pregnancy. In Kalamazoo, so Cradle Kalamazoo is also a coalition of about 30 partners that we have here. So it's made up of the hospitals, home visitation programs, other what we would call funding streams, so like the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, Mission United, United Way. It is a coalition that is specifically addressing the rate, the infant mortality rate here. The goal is in the next 10 years that the infant mortality rate is at 0. We receive bi-yearly reviews on the amount of reduction of infant mortality here in Kalamazoo, which is very important. In addition to Cradle Kalamazoo, we have a public policy agenda this year for 2018. And we are launching our first ever state advocacy campaign. And it's going to be focusing on eliminating the disproportionate disciplinary outcomes of youth of color in schools and communities by promoting equitable practices and policies and mandating trainings for school officials and law enforcement. Again, so the overview of the advocacy agenda is to mandate trainings for school officials officials, that's anyone from administrators, anyone who's in the classroom, and police officers and security officers in schools. We are going to be doing a review of disciplinary policy at the state level, and urging our policymakers to do the same thing. We also are going to submit recommendations and amendments for Senate Bills 103 and 105. They both address chronic absences, truancy, and suspension rates among students of color. They are asking schools to, so Senate Bill 103 is basically saying that the zero tolerance policy does not work, and that's why we're supporting it. And so typically what happens is they will suspend a child for not coming to school, and we're actively advocating against that, right? Because we know that they need to access those spaces and know that's important, and that excessive expulsion from school and excessive suspension leads to other things, what we would now call the school to prison pipeline or the cradle to prison pipeline. Senate Bill 105 focuses on schools submitting data around their suspension rates. However, the data is not aggregate, and that is one of our recommendations that we will be making to policymakers, is that the data has to be aggregate and broken down by sex and by race, which it currently is not. And so then that creates gaps, and then we're not addressing the racial disparities amongst those things. I think it's important to talk about those things because suspension rates here, specifically in the state of Michigan, a student of color is 3.3 times more likely to be suspended for a non-violent offense versus their white counterparts. And we're seeing that across the board in the state of Michigan and in other states, specifically states who have zero tolerance policies, that likelihood is a lot higher. That is essentially the focus of our advocacy agenda and the focus of our advocacy efforts for this year in regards to things directly to our mission as far as eliminating racism. That is my side. I know I didn't take up 10 minutes. However, I didn't feel like it was 10. I didn't feel like 10 minutes was appropriate for all of that. I do a more of a question-answer type of person. So if you have questions, please make sure to ask me. We can definitely engage in that.
You want to change your slide back to the MLK quote, or is that either way?
You got to stand.
Please. Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to get to this relatively quickly. In the spirit in which I've interpreted the charge, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, but also moving very quickly to theory to practice, some elements of what that has constituted for me, and then an example, a more thorough example, all within 10 minutes, hopefully. Okay. My thrust is as a social worker, a social work educator, and an anthropologist who focuses on the cultural dynamics of race, ethnicity, and social class, primarily in education and community life. But in this regard, what I've embraced is more so developing theory and then moving very quickly from theory to practice and then back from practice to theory. That is how what we've learned after we've attempted to apply our theoretical orientations are informed and need to be modified by on-the-ground application. And so that has meant for me a part of my training, just to orient you, with anthropology at University of Michigan and Sherry Ortner at the time in theories what we were calling practice theory, which we were developing in the 80s and middle 80s through the early 90s, a series of papers that attempted to illustrate the relationship, the dialectic between structure, history, practice or praxis in the sense in which Marx espoused it, and human agency, and most recently looking at social movements as a part of that dialectic, all in the spirit of social science theory, coming from Marx through Max Weber, through Tal Parsons, all the way up to the present. But my influence was also Geertzian, Clifford Geertz, and the multiple ways in which you look at the symmetry and meaning, and how meaning plays out, and ultimately, as a text, can inform how you interpret the world. So I've tried to make sense of all of that. It's crazy as a social worker and anthropologist. And what this has meant as an educator for me is to train students to think reflexively, right? Is to be thoughtful of what they're doing, why they're doing, the role of structure, history, those sorts of things, in reproducing the circumstances in which they find their clients. And so what this has meant also, more importantly, is that many students come with their homemade notions. Many of them, not all of them by far, are seeking their certifications, their credentials, as a means of sanctioning what they already believe to be the things that should happen, the remedies that should be applied to the things you've talked about, to issues of poverty, to school failures, the gaps in education, all of those things. So the job is to engage them in a way that helps them to see those things about themselves without demeaning them or humiliating them in any sense of the word, but also helping them then to find ways to change their practice. Peculiarly, social workers, when they practice, always the analogy is sort of is they get to close the door in terms of what they're doing, particularly if they're in we call clinical practice, where they're counseling people in mental health, in correction systems, at the YWCA for sexual. They get to close the door, and because of rules of confidentiality, they don't have to share what's going on there. And so they have these opportunities, and you find it revealing itself that they move away from what we've tried to teach them in terms of reflexivity, the focus on what we call self-determination, which is essentially a dialogue with your client that helps you to help them determine their future, as opposed to you advising them and telling them what they should be doing. It's about how do they understand their issues, how do you help them understand their issues, and then how do you collaborate with them on solutions that they can select for themselves, as opposed to giving them the answer, which is often what people want, but it's not in their best interest. I mean, it's sort of like I can feed you, I can give you a fish or teach you how to fish. I mean, I can tell you some answers, you can try them, but they aren't ultimately going to resolve the deeper aspects of why you're in your circumstance to begin with, and why people around you in your communities and neighborhoods are in a similar circumstance, and what you can do to help change the structures that undergird those systemic problems. So that's what we really try to do with students. We try to, again, essentially teach them to act in terms of praxis, which is reflection, sort of Paulo Freire's sense of it as well, acting in terms of conscientiousness and collaboration, ethical decision-making, ethical practice. And as I've said, to help them engage in a dialogic process with clients, organizations, communities, in which they collaborate as opposed to direct the change that needs to happen. Now, for me, my role has been as an advocate, a consultant, and critical analyst in institutions. So I've served on boards like the ones you presented, YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, boards of directors, Big Brothers Big Sisters, Interact, and the list goes on. And what that service has meant for me, it's just as if I were working with a client, helping them understand the role that the organization they were in has a role in reproducing some of the inequalities that they claim to be addressing. And so I remember distinctly a couple of interactions with one of the agencies, I won't call their name, but they wanted to implement a character education program. Now, they primarily served African Americans, so my question was, what do you mean by character? you know, and so we got, and who's defining it? And so there were these bankers and lawyers who were trying to define what they thought character meant. They were on the board telling, you know, what character meant. And you know, I didn't want to tell them what to do. I said, you know, that's problematic. That's not the only way to understand character, you know. I mean, let's look at this more broadly. A lot of tension, you know, doing that. But that's the kind of work that I've attempted to engage in as a board member, trying to bring a perspective as a critical analyst. And in particular, my focus has been, as I've said earlier, on education in general from birth forward, but largely high school. And again, what I wanted to look at is the ways in which education, not so much in terms of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but in terms of the cultural and social aspects of education, what goes on between teachers and students, what goes on between students, what goes on regarding the interpretation of school policy when you are making decisions about students. What do those things mean, and how are they reproducing inequality? How are they producing what today we call the achievement gap? How do they play a role in sustaining the achievement gap that we see between African Americans and other groups in high school in particular? But really, you know, we look at the data, it really begins in preschool. We begin to test and look at the kinds of interactions that you would track with preschoolers in terms of verbalizations and their interaction with objects and play, and you begin to see variations, or what people want to call a gap between, say, low-income children and middle-class children. So it begins there, continues into middle school. Sometimes it's mediated a little bit by Head Start, but then it returns again and continues, and then by third grade, we begin to see really big gaps, and we begin to see students tracking, for whatever reason, into lives that are going to lead to prison or some other maladaptive behavior. So I've tried to focus on some of that. I've tried to look at the role that education has in impacting life, the quality of life, income, obviously, lifestyle opportunities, and life chances. I've tried to, as I've said, work with educators in schools when I have been able to do that, to help them understand how they can play a role in helping students achieve the kind of liberation, autonomy that would benefit them, but that often teachers understand are outside of the mainstream curriculums that they are trained to teach. The mainstream, and I mean by curriculum, not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, the curriculum of the rules of engagement, how students are even supposed to answer questions. You'll find that low income and some urban students, or rural students too, and this is observation as well as research, they're more animated in their interactions in school. So when the teacher says, Johnny, tell me the capital of Utah or something like that, Johnny's going to jump up, and the teacher said, no, don't sit down. So that's a social curriculum. But you said, wait a minute, what's that about? Let's understand it differently than what you've been trained, so that we can help these children achieve, as Martha Nussbaum would say, their capacities and move on in life. So from that, having said all of that, let me move, there are many projects I've done, but let me move to one in particular real quickly, and that was in Charlotte, North Carolina. What we were working on there is, we had a National Science Foundation grant. It's working with the sociologists of education. We're trying to find ways for parents to increase their engagement or involvement in their children's course selection and placement for middle and high school. Right? And so in North Carolina, a part of the state constitution is that parents have a right to select the course selections for their students. Many parents don't know that. So one part of our our work was to work with lawyers to help us interpret the Constitution. So we put together a program called the Math and Science Equity Project. This Math and Science Equity Project was supposed to increase the enrollment of middle and high school African American students in math and science classes. What happens is that African American children, and though they're not the only one, get tracked away from high-level math and science courses, and you know the consequence of that in terms of its preparation for STEM courses in college and so on. But they get tracked away from that based on the perceptions of their instructors. Sometimes based on tests which can be marginally interpreted, but essentially that's what happens. So at the same time, we knew that based on the research, many of these children, if placed in the right circumstance, with the right skilled teachers, can achieve in algebra 2, trigonometry and calculus, can achieve beyond, say, introduction to biology. They can actually move through chemistry and get even to physics in high school. But they take some concerted effort, number one. Number two, though, their parents had to know that they had a right to request that. You know, in other words, if the school sent home the students' course selections for a given year, and they had them in general math, the parent had a right to change and say, no, I want my child in Algebra 1 or Algebra or whatever for the most part. And if they fail, they fail. But you know, that's understanding you have that choice. Of course, you can hear the answer to that. Many teachers said, well, you're setting them up for failure when you do that. Well, we could show them reams of research that suggests that that's not true if certain ingredients are in place in terms of the school, in terms of home life, instruction, and things of that nature. So the project was community-based. We organized ourselves, went out into churches and different community-based places that parents felt comfortable with. We hired for our team from the beginning what we call parent advocates and educators, and their job was to educate us as researchers as to what would facilitate parents accepting some of the material that we wanted to teach. How did we need to shape it? What are the things we needed to do to make it so that it is palatable to them? And so we sent, to make it a long story short, a series of workshops engaging parents with other parents beside us as coaches and teachers, helping these parents understand their rights, helping them increase their comfort, their knowledge and their comfort and familiarity with the subjects that their children were going to take. For example, we actually had adult educators coming in to illustrate ways in what, for example, Algebra 1 involved, and the ways in which Algebra 1 could be understood by pulling out illustrations, examples from everyday life. So if you're playing Bid Whist as a card game or Trump or something like that, the educators would show how algebra and other mathematical concepts are applied in that way to increase the parents' comfort. And these parents would light up and say, oh, I never thought of it that way. We had one of our researchers who was a science educator, for example, in illustrating science and chemistry, different aspects of chemistry, helped them to learn how to make bubble bath and perfume and stuff like that. But anything that they could relate to. And it greatly increased their confidence. And then the other piece, and there were many others that we focused on, is how do you talk to teachers? How do you perceive yourself? How can you envision yourself going into the school? You're a parent, you may have a high school education or less, talking to a principal or a teacher in a way that that could be effective for you, in a way that that helps you manage your anxiety and your discomfort. So we would spend coaching classes on helping them increase their confidence in doing that through practice and things of that nature. So we did all of that with them. It was a lot of work, wasn't as fully effective as we wanted it to be, and there were lots of incentives. Now, I'm going to close with this. The most interesting thing, well, not the most, but one of the interesting things for me, it's a part, again, of the ways in which oppressed groups reproduce their oppression, which is what I study about African Americans, not just the ways in which external systems oppress them, but the ways in which we incorporate oppressive features of that system into our understandings of ourselves and into our practices. And so here's one thing. First thing, I'm going in, I'm the only one African American. We had several African American, but I'm the lead researcher. The other lead researcher is white. And I'm coming in, and this happens in Kalamazoo too. It used to happen a lot in my past. But the first thing is, okay, wow, you're a professor, you're a doctor with all this stuff. What do you think we should do? What's the answer? You're going to help us, right? You're going to, no. And the anxiety in me to resist that and say that's not my role. And it happens even when I introduce myself to people I'm not working with in a professional way, particularly African Americans in communities, is because of my credentials, their perception is that I have answers, or educated people have answers, and that I can give it to them. Well, even if I had it, I can't give it to you. I can help you arrive at it, help us, as Richard Rorty would say, achieve our country in a more equal way, a way that involves more equality. But I'm not going to be there all the time, and people like me aren't going to be there. So it's best if I help facilitate a process in communities, in organizations, and others where they understand ways of facilitating these structural changes, these understandings of oppression, of the way structural oppressions and things of that nature work. It's best if I lead them with the ways in which they can engage in those processes for themselves. And so that's the struggle for me. It continues to be the struggle. Here I've been a part of University Community Empowerment Center in the College of Health and Human Services, and that's been a sort of sticking point for me. Is I think some of my colleagues, rightfully so, want to go in and do things for communities, and I really resist that. I want to go, let me say that differently. They want to go in and do things for communities in the sense of providing a direct service of some sort. My sense is I want to go in and help them when they've identified that they need a service, how they can find access to that service, how they can understand the pluses and minuses of that service, how they can then engage a set of processes in which they can continue to find ways to identify their needs and find professionals who can meet their needs, and to find indigenous resources already in the community. That's difficult. We're trained as professionals. If you're a psychologist or if you're an educator, that's what you want to do. You want to analyze people and counsel them. But to pull back and say, how can I help you arrive at the answers for yourselves using my knowledge as a counselor, using my knowledge as an educator, using my knowledge as a professor to facilitate that, is really not a daunting challenge. It's something that is at the front of what I try to do. So that's it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, you of our panelists. So is there can we go until the party's over, or do we need to stop at a certain time?
Depends on how long your party wants to be.
We're gonna party
Yeah,
all night, guaranteed it. Okay.
Dale?
Oh, you didn't want to read about Andy's MacBook Pro?
I like that
I'm gonna
MLK quote.
Okay.
Can I turn it off?
I'm gonna leave it. I don't want to touch it anymore. We're gonna open it up to open Q&A. So the way we're gonna do it is, if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm gonna give you a number. It's your job. I'm like putting the work on you. It's your job to remember your number. I get you to call out numbers, right? If you have a follow-up question of somebody gave their question, you're like, I want to say something about that too. Give me the old one finger. That's a follow-up. If I give out the numbers, we start asking questions, and you don't have a follow-up, you have a new question that you formulated in your brain, just raise your hand, and I'll add you to the queue somehow, non-verbally. Questions? 1,
could
Two.
tell who you're pointing at.
Jen, one.
Two. Other questions? Three. Four. Question one, please.
I'm sorry, I'm blanking on your name from the YWCA. Demetrius, I'm sorry, I'm the worst of these. So I found out recently that apparently your organization is the only place in the city or county of Kalamazoo where a woman can go to get a rape kit done. I don't know how to turn that into a question except to say, like, how is the city not on fire because of that? Why do the police not have them? Why are there not, like, riots in Lansing about that? Like, it boggles my mind. Do you guys, like, bankroll that yourselves? Do you have to pay out of pocket to get those tests run? And I guess a related question, there was an article in our school paper recently about how apparently Kalamazoo can be a nexus of human trafficking activity. And that your organization works with that as well. I have no idea how to get a handle on how to start to help with that, but I'm wondering, I want to hear more about those things, and are the police doing their part, or making an effort at all, and are public institutions failing here? Are they reacting to these problems, or are you guys just out there alone?
So you have like 1,000 questions in one. So
Yeah.
if I don't answer all of them, please make sure that you check me so I can give you efficient information. One, yes, the YWCA Kalamazoo is the only service provider for rape kits, also what we call nurse exams in the county. The state of Michigan has very weak laws around sexual assault, which limits funding, which limits a lot of things. I don't know if you've seen recently, but someone from Wayne State University kind of championed like the backlog of rape kits at the state and secured the funding for them to bring them up to speed. We do pay, we are grant funded, so our sexual assault program is grant funded through BOCA. Our nurse exam is done, we only have one licensed nurse on staff, and it's 24 hours, 7 days a week you get a nurse exam, any day, anytime. With that, the police, we have a relationship with the police. It's ever growing. I will say that they may not be where they need to be. However, they are in that process. Like, they're growing. Our relationship is growing, and their understanding on how they respond to situations is growing. We have a partnership with them specifically in regards to our emergency response team. So when there is a domestic violence call, the police will call our emergency response advocate, and they will show up on site to advocate for the victim or survivor in the situation. We just opened a human trafficking shelter. It opened on January 22nd. Human trafficking is a problem in the state of Michigan, right? And I think people don't understand how big of an issue it is, because when you think of human trafficking, you think of sex trafficking, and it encompasses so much more, specifically labor trafficking. And because we have so many rural counties and rural areas in the state of Michigan, labor trafficking is a huge issue in Michigan. In addition to that, you asked me how can you get involved with the human trafficking? Was that the next question?
Yeah, I guess I just want to know, like, what to watch for, what to recognize, and any way that I can just, as a resident of the community, be useful. What resources do y'all need? What do you need advocacy for, with state and local government?
So there are multiple ways that you can get involved in many of our initiatives. So there are options. So there is a human trafficking coalition, and you can get involved by signaling, and they have specific tactics that they are doing, which is, one, securing funding, right, to make sure that programs are sustainable. Two, ensuring that or strengthening protections of workers here in the state, specifically immigrant workers who are coming here for seasonal work. And then our Cradle Kalamazoo is a coalition that you can also sit on. The only two programs that have state level agendas is human trafficking, and the public policy agenda around eliminating discrimination amongst disciplinary policies in regards to youth of color in schools and communities. So I can, if you want to touch base right after this, I can give you the direct contact information to both individuals for that, and you can get you involved ASAP. As far as why is the city not on fire and involved, because it is an issue of a marginalized community, right? And so we specifically see lack of involvement in things when it doesn't specifically impact or affect dominant culture.
So just a quick follow, you said you do training with the police on like sexual assault and trying to expand their understanding of that, or?
Yeah.
Good.
So we do trainings for sexual assault with police officers and faith-based organizations.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Question 2?
So this, your name is Demetrius?
Yeah.
So I think this is a question for new Demetrius and possibly also for you, Linwood. So I was speaking with someone who serves on the public school board in Kalamazoo, and I was asking about why the graduation rate was 30% for Black male teenagers in Kalamazoo. My understanding is that the graduation rate is much higher, in fact, for Black female teenagers. And when I asked the question, the response was racism, which I think is very clearly unhelpful because I'm trying to understand the intersection of gender and race in this specific context, and that's completely elided in this kind of response. So I guess this is a question that I want to put to you, and if you could address this question in a way that might allow me to pass this information on to like my students in my race and gender class. Like, what is your sense of what is going on in Kalamazoo, where there's the Kalamazoo Promise? What is going on for Black young men in our high schools, in public high schools?
I'll start, yeah. That's interesting. I had that on my list. You know, the Promise, for example, the Kalamazoo Promise, and I've written a little bit about it, not a lot, but some other people have written more extensively at Western in the anthropology, is what I call a back-end program. In other words, the benefit is after you've graduated high school. It's the front end where the issue needs to be addressed as well, which we'll get to. And the front end is preschool and K through 12. And before they ever get to high school, what are the characteristics of their lives and education as it interacts with education that prepares them for failure, for dropout?
Yeah.
And so, and it's similar across the country. You know, you can predict school outcomes based on neighborhood outcomes. And you find that Kalamazoo is easily describable in terms of its distinct neighborhoods. And so you will find that many of the dropouts are coming from identifiable zip codes, and that it's been continuous across time. The next question is then, what's within those zip codes? You know, what's happening in terms of people's behaviors, attitudes, and practices? And then you get into things like, you know, the infant mortality, you know, the people aren't fully taking care of themselves in terms of health, either because of access or because of education and awareness, so they need navigators. It has to do with what happens when students aren't in school. In other words, what's going on at home between parents and children, where we find some deficits occurring. What happens in the relationships that these students have in their neighborhoods, you know, children to children or student to student. What are the social relationships? Not just the conditions of poverty, but what are students actually doing that are counterproductive for education, and that essentially lays the ingredients for a dropout, so that by the time they get to high school, they're already disengaged. And many of the students will tell you who's probably going to drop out and not graduate. So it's not even, I would bet, for, you know, these school board members, they know, because this data gets presented to them quite often in terms of, you can say racism, but what's inside of them? What are the activities, the things that occur in people's daily lives that contribute to a scenario in which you have children who are going to disengage from school. So it would be, to focus on the demographics, the characteristics, the lifestyles, life chances, and the ways in which the system facilitates a lack of change in those things. Because it isn't as if poor people want to remain poor, or people who live in violent neighborhoods want to stay in violent neighborhoods. There are things that contribute to them not being able to get out of those circumstances.
Also, I think that we don't put enough emphasis on like educators and administrative responsibilities to be culturally competent in their classrooms and what that looks like, as far as having accurate representation at the front of the classroom that significantly reduces some of the biases that students of color interact with. I think it is safe to say that students who drop out are typically students who have, from pre-K, K through 12, been severely impacted by suspension rates, truancy, and chronic absences, which is predominantly determined by the educator in that classroom. What behavior is the student displaying that they may feel that may be threatening, that is not actually threatening. I think one key thing that we oftentimes don't talk about is when we talk about inner city schools, specifically here in Kalamazoo, where the population of students of color is fairly high, the teachers don't represent that. And I'm not saying that segregation is the answer. However, pre-integration, the literacy rate amongst African American students was 90%. And that's because they had educators who looked like them, who understood their background, who could facilitate to them in a way that was responsive to their needs in that context. And I think that is not happening in Kalamazoo, and it's not even just Kalamazoo, right? And it's with across the nation. So,
where does gender, I'm wondering specifically where gender fits in?
So I think gender, I think that fits in specifically when I'm talking about bias, right? And how teachers see black men, right? And we have young black male students who are 5 years old, who are suspended at a much higher rate because of their behavior. We have teachers who do not view young black students who identify as male, who are 5 years old, as young black students. They view them as grown, threatened individuals, and that bias comes out a lot. I've seen it. I've been in Teach for America, which is an organization that specifically recruits teachers to go into urban schools, and those teachers don't even look like the students, right? And that is important. I also think that we should say, I think that Kalamazoo may be unique because women of color, specifically young girls of color, are experiencing the same racial disparities in education as far as disciplinary action, what that looks like and how that's impacting the educational experience.
So I'd probably say that I'd love to keep going with questions, but if you need to go for a reason, don't feel pressured to stay. We're running a bit long. Any questions? Yes, this is great. Thank you, Dr. B. Question 3, please.
I'm sorry, Daniel. I think I didn't completely hear your instructions about what my responsibilities are as a questioner. So, am I limiting my question to one panelist, or can I pose?
Ask any question you like.
So, for you, the prisoner education program, is that something that's patterned after a program that already exists? And why Lakeland? Is it Lakeland and Colbart? So that's for you. And then, is it Cousins? Dr. Cousins? Can you explain what tracking is in education and what that causes? I mean, we were talking about the middle school and high school tracking through the panel earlier. Some of those tracks were set. By the time we get to middle school and high school, it's fun to break out. But maybe not everybody understands what tracking is and the implications of it. And then secondly, because I never feel like program, I'm curious who started it. Was it a parent advocacy thing? Were there teachers saying that parents needed to be more involved? What was the genesis of that? Who was the genesis of that?
I I didn't get the last part of that, I'm sorry.
Who was the genesis of the parent program? Was there a groundswell among parents who saw that parents weren't involved enough? Or were there educators saying, we need to get more parents involved? We need parents to know what their rights are. I'm just wondering who started that.
Right.
Just out of curiosity, so wherever you want to start.
Can I do the Lakeland part? Can you do the model after part?
Please. So there are just lots of different programs, right? So we were struck. So as we wrote the research paper in one section is essentially saying, look, there's a ton of these programs that exist, but is it modeled after one specifically? No, because they're all just a little bit different, right? Like some we're looking at there are differences in funding, there are differences in who teaches, right? Either graduate students or different faculty, something like that. There are programs such as the Set Up program. They have professors going into prisons taking, let's say, in Western Michigan, we take 15 undergraduates in the school, go into a prison and teach 15 incarcerated individuals. So our model that we figured out, I say we still don't have it as nailed down. Our thing is that we're trying to give college credits so they can put it towards some sort of degree, want there to be these tangible outcomes in that way. Two, we're trying to completely fund the program for the students. We don't want them to pay anything. Some programs, Jackson Community College, for example, they have kind of they have different models. So one is that they're part of the Second Chance Pell program, which obviously get their education as part of that, or $100. They also have a self-pay portion where their students sing sounds, get their education. Right, so ours is kind of just a synthesis as it stands of those programs.
Yeah, and so the why Lakeland question. There are already a number of institutions where programs currently exist, sort of in the southern quarter of Michigan. Many of them further eastward in the middle of the state, like by Jackson, where they have their programs. I think they service like multiple institutions even. For some reason, though, and it's not entirely clear to me why, Lakeland currently just doesn't have a running program, and they're super keen for one, and they're they're accessible to us. So it's just kind of like prudential concerns like that.
So we
I was wondering if there's a proximity or if there's something else.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that, and so we spoke with the representative from the Michigan Department of Corrections who deals with the education part of it, and he was like, "That's the one," and they're pretty. I think they're pretty.
Tracking first. The tracking, which is more challenged in, say, the last 40 years than currently, is a system originally where, based on two students' test scores, they would decide their ability to achieve, and therefore which courses they should take, and therefore where they should end up in the workforce. So the most blatant cases were those who were tracked to vocational education, and thus a life as a plumber, things of that nature, versus those who were tracked into the college track. And then there are some who are in the middle. It still happens where, though not officially and not formally, teachers get together and decide which students should be in which classes, coming from middle to high school, for example. And then in high school, even within a math class, which kinds of students are you going to have together? The high achievers versus the low achievers, the behavioral problems versus the non-behavioral problems. And it doesn't matter in terms of race. If, in other words, you had a predominantly African-American or Hispanic, school, they still track even among the homogeneous group, racial group or ethnic group. They still track there. They certainly do it in integrated schools, and it's almost laughable that you will see most of in a school in which you have majority whites in particular, and some African Americans, you will find African Americans underrepresented in the higher level courses. Now, the issue with that, and I teach a course, and some of it is self-selected. Black students self-select out of the courses that are filled with say high achievers because there are none of the other students who they relate to in there. So there's some twists and turns in there with tracking, but that's how it goes. The issue of parent involvement happens both ways. Generally, I don't know a teacher who would say parents shouldn't be involved, but they will say whether it's a middle-class suburban school or an urban inner-city school that parents aren't as involved as they would want them to be. And so that creates an opportunity for teachers and parents to work together because on one hand, many parents want to be involved, and we try to find ways to help them be involved by accommodating their work schedules, which is the big piece. How can you because many of them don't have jobs that would allow them to come into, say, parent-teachers conferences or any of the others. Either they're tired, they're angry, they're frustrated, or they just don't have the schedule. So we look at those things, and then we get teachers who understand and are not threatened by parents. And together, those two create the opportunity for increased parent engagement. There are entire journals devoted to parent engagement. And in my research, the group we call the PEP Squad, Parents Empowering Parents. And so what we did is try to place parents in the lead in recruiting other parents and helping them generate the resources, skills, knowledge that they needed to increase their engagement. And that meant if you can't ever get to school, what else can you do as a parent? What else do you need to know as a parent to help your child be educationally successful? So it happens, if I understand your question, on both ends. I think you get the grassroots involvement of parents, but you partner with teachers and administrators to help facilitate the process. But I don't think, in my work, you're ever going to get the kind of participation you want, but you can certainly improve it. It's a challenge.
Do you know for that particular research that you're doing, the work that you're doing in North Carolina, who launched it? Do you know who hired?
I'm sorry?
Do you know who launched the program you're talking about in North Carolina? Do you know who launched it? Was it a parent-teacher group? Was it a parent group that launched it?
No. Did we launch it with parent groups and others?
Did a parent want to start that versus the school asking them?
They did, yeah. When we ended the project, we left many of the parents, we left these groups, like the PEP Squad and others, as self-operating, beyond our practice. And I've seen similar groups. I don't know if they copied our research, but almost word for word in Louisville, Kentucky, they were doing it, sort of the parent engagement model that we had developed. But yeah, I think we left them there with the ingredients. We gave them material, we gave them folders and binders filled with material, all again about how can you take this and run with it for yourselves, because professionals aren't always present, aren't always consistent in engaging.
Yeah, I should, out of respect, can I make it a little bit brief?
Oh yeah, very. So this law in North Carolina that you identified, I'm curious about the genesis of it, and I guess I'm wondering, are there people that use it in the opposite way? So in other words, are there like white reactionary parents who say, oh great, we get to choose the curriculum, well that means I don't want my kids learning any social science or history or nothing critical about America, etc. Like, and is that where that law came from? Did it come from like the Christian homeschool crowd, and how common are these laws?
I'm going to ask you, we're hearing aids, so I got some question to ask.
I was just wondering, this law you identified and were able to use in North Carolina, where did it originate? Like, I'm wondering if it originated actually from like Christian conservative adjutants who said we don't want our kids learning into that history or social science or anything critical of America.
No, we didn't.
Okay.
We didn't get any of that at all. Because, there were some religious conservative parents in our group, but they all felt like education was, the route that they needed. They felt, I remember a few of them, that they were able to take care of the religious piece at home. That what happened in school would not infiltrate the values and beliefs that they wanted their children to believe. And
do you know how many states have that law or something similar?
That's what I don't know. I don't know. I focused on North Carolina. I'm not sure if other states' laws are similar to the state constitution, in fact, in North Carolina.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you.
Question 4.
So my question's for Dr. Cousins.
Oh,
Yeah. So you talked about the character development and how there was like this top-down program. You were saying you're like trying to design like what character development looks like, and you wanted it maybe to be more like community-driven from the people who were involved. Could you talk about like what those two models of character development look like?
Now you're talking not in schools. I'm sorry. Again, you're talking.
Well, maybe in schools. You're talking about a character development program in schools, and when you were giving your presentation.
Okay, just repeat that one more time. Your question.
Yeah, could you explain like the difference between like character development being devised by like lawyers and educators versus some other model?
Yeah. Again, I don't have the answer to what kind of character students should be taught or programs should support, but it shouldn't be, for example, character meaning that you don't ever swear, for example. And so what we want to teach children, these people you might have said is that there are certain languages and things of that nature you don't use. Or let's say one of the others is that you don't wear your pants hanging down, which there are white kids in the suburbs from upper middle class families who wear their pants hanging down. So, in other words, if I can answer you, there are these sort of signals or symbols that they associate with thuggery, with dishonesty, with violence, that they I think also only associate or mostly associate with low-income children, and then also mostly associate with children of color. And that my role is to, when they would say what they meant, because my job is pushing, what do you mean? Give me examples. In some cases, like I said, the pants hanging down, or using street language or something like that, how those things aren't only the property of low-income poor children. So if you are going to teach them not to do that, can you do it in a cultural context? Can you do it in a way that helps them understand that it isn't so much that it's wrong, but that if you do it, here's how people are going to respond to it. So you have some choices to make. If you're okay with how they respond to you and how they're going to limit your choices, then you keep doing what you do. If not, you don't. And what you find is that then these kids, if you teach it effectively, they code switch. In other words, they know when to pull the pants up, and they know when to use appropriate and inappropriate language. But if you help them interpret those characteristics that have been described about them in ways that are demeaning and negative and unidimensional, one-dimensional, then you leave them questioning their identity, and then they disengage. They close the door on you and say, okay, I'm going to listen to you, but when you finish, it's in one ear and out the other. So, so that process too, you try to help them understand what you might call cultural inclusion and cultural diversity. We were doing this long before those terms became prominent. But it's a part of that, understanding what these things you call character look like and how we need to be reflexive about those. So if I
I think you have. Thank you.
sorry.
One more time, if anybody has questions. Nobody's going to judge, no judges. You're not sure, you haven't fully formed it.
I have a question. I don't know if I can ask a question at the presentation. It's specifically for the business education. I was wondering if there was anything within the program that addresses like the racial disparities amongst incarceration rates and what that looks like. And if not, are there plans?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question for us. It's something that's like our perennial concern. We're thinking if the model is such that we're going to use the few resources that we have, educators. We're going to try to take something like the model that we teach here and take it into prison. Now, as far as our partnership with the MDOC goes, it seems like this is something that we can specify. Like, look, we want to do something that's more inclusive. From there, and I think they're pretty amenable to whatever we want. And I think, I don't know, this is all I'm going to say, like, I'm not sure. Okay, I'll say this. So the racial disparities are a big part of our motivation. So we know that something like 80% of the U.S. population is Black people specifically, but the prison population of Black folks is something like 30%. I'm telling you things you already know, right? So we know this is a problem. And so I guess we struggle with, if what we can do is provide education, right? We know that racial disparities are a problem, but also, even if all the people of color got let out of prison, there's still a lot of people left in prison, right? So we're thinking, well, how can we work within our means to provide something to incarcerated folks? And I know this is, an insufficient answer. So if there are suggestions, we're completely open to it. And also, I'll repeat again that it seems like this program we could tailor to whatever we need to do. And so our worry is that, again, always, let's say it is our motivation, right? That we know that there's racial disparities. I'm not sure we have the authority or the skills to translate that into some program that targets just these specific populations, right? So that's the problem that we have, and I think we'd love to have some feedback. We're desperate for that. I don't know if you have something else. We talked about this. We talked about this from the start, right? So this is something that we are very much concerned about.
I mean, the only thing I would say is I don't think we have a sufficient answer to the question. And I would leave it at that.
That's better.
What I feel capable of saying.
That's better than what I said. Yeah. I mean, so I don't know, if this is something, so we love to talk about it, right? If it's something that we can steal some of your time in private, that's fine. If you like to have the conversation now, that's fine too, right? I mean, do you have thoughts or suggestions on?
There was
certainly. Please.
Oh, so I have a because I just can't stay silent, right? We're talking about MLK. I think a lot of the context in this conversation, I wish the person that asked the question about the board was still in the room, because I would still say this. It's still the same narrative of white people wanting to do this work, but leaning on the experiences and the knowledge of Black people who don't have that leadership or don't have that title. And so to be on a board of education, but then ask why is this the data, makes no sense, right? To be creating a program but not having a clue of what the answer may be makes no sense. And so it's no shade. It's just the truth. It's the same narrative constantly, and it's white people elevating how Black people are, or whoever of color is said to give their experiences, or we need your voice, or can you give us this advice? Yet you're the one prospering while we're still in our community, or wherever that may be. So I just felt it appropriate to say in whatever context that may help somebody understand or whatever. Thank you.
I'll say, we love that feedback, and more than anyone else can give us, we will take it. We really appreciate it. With that, I would like to thank our panelists, all three of them. Let's give them a warm round of